All right, gents. Genesis 1, introduction, and I sent out a PDF, and apparently Steve already printed it out, but I sent out the PDF just because it might be a little easier for you to follow along since I don't have a ton of commentary this morning because this is an introductory session about Genesis and talking about the who, the where, the why, and all that kind of stuff. And some of this stuff's a little technical, but it's necessary to think through a little bit before we just jump into the text and immediately start looking. Spoiler alert, we're just going to do one verse today, okay? That's it and that's all. There will be times throughout Genesis where we will take entire chapters and big chunks because it is a prose narrative kind of thing, which we'll talk about in a minute. So starting off, who wrote Genesis? You know the answer to this. Moses, okay. Moses, for 2,000 years, all believers have believed that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and the Pentateuch is just the first 5 books, sometimes called the books of Moses, sometimes called the law, although the law can refer to one of 3 things. It can refer to the Old Testament as a whole, it can refer to the first 5 books of the Bible or of the Old Testament, and it can also refer specifically to, of course, the 10 Commandments found in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. Where are they found? Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. You need to know that, have that committed to memory, where those 2 things are. Mark 7:10, Jesus refers to Moses having written those books of the Bible. And so if it's good enough for Jesus, good enough for us. Anybody that says elsewhere, anybody that says otherwise, on them. There is this thing, and I'm going to spend maybe 1 minute talking about this, but it was a huge, huge deal a couple hundred years ago, this thing called the documentary hypothesis. It's known as the JEDP. You do not need to know this. I'm just telling you about it because it is out there. And if you do any Old Testament studies, if you get into any of the academic side of things with German higher criticism, essentially what they did is they started off with the assumption that the Bible, isn't true. They didn't take it at face value. And the question became, who wrote it? And they came up with this, what's called the documentary hypothesis, and it's known as the JEDP theory. J and H, it's an acronym. So J, which was a transliteration and screw up of the Yahwehist or the Jehovahist. So it had to do with the way that supposed different writers referred to God. So there's the covenant name of God, or what's called the Tetragrammaton. If you read the introduction to your Bible, which I encourage you highly, highly, highly to do, because there's different names for God, and one of the names is of course Yahweh. Used to be translated Jehovah sometimes. The personal covenantal name of God. The theory went that was a different author writing, and then later all these things were edited together by somebody else, probably the priest, which is the P in the JEDP theory. So you had the Yahwehist or the Jehovahist, the Elohist. So Elohim is just a general word for God or gods. Elohim is actually technically plural. There's kind of some built-in, some of our Trinitarian theology comes from some of this idea, which we'll talk about later. So E is the Elohist, P is the priestly material, P is the priestly, I meant to say D. D is the Deuteronomist. What's the Deuteronomist? What's whoever gave the actual specific law in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is almost a repeat of what's in Leviticus with a little different flair. And so the idea is that there were these 4 different guys, somebody along the way put all this together, and they would say, of course Moses didn't write it because it records the death of Moses in Deuteronomy. Okay, we will all admit that. Obviously Moses didn't write his own death. So obviously there was somebody that recorded that, probably Joshua. All of that being said, JEDP is trash. It's just trash. It's stupid. And even people who don't believe the Bible, by and large, have abandoned that idea. It will pop up from time to time if you get into hardcore academic studies about the Old Testament. I'm only bringing it up to expose you to it, to let you know that it's out there, and that it really holds no water. Who do we believe wrote the Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible? Who wrote Genesis? Moses. Okay, that's what we believe. We're good conservative Christians. The occasion. What's the occasion of the writing of Genesis? Correlates, of course, to the time of Moses. Its content naturally goes back to the beginning. In fact, the word Genesis means beginning, depending on how you understand it. The introduction to the 5-volume Pentateuch. That's what Pentateuch means, is just 5-volume. That comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. That's where that word comes from. It means 5 volumes, sometimes called the Law, sometimes called the Book of Moses. Naturally, even though it records events that predate Moses, obviously that's. Let me say this as well. The Pentateuch or Genesis is probably not the first book written. Okay, Job is probably the first book written. Job probably precedes the Pentateuch, probably written during or directly prior to the time of the patriarchs, which is recorded in Genesis. We don't know that for absolutely certain, but there are some internal cues that cue us in on that. It's interesting to think about that the very first question that's ever answered in the revelation of God is not actually the beginning, but it's the problem of evil, which persists to this day. That is the major problem. Now, this is not a class on the book of Job. We're talking about Genesis, but I bring that up because most people think that Genesis was written first because it naturally records the creation of everything. So, just intuitively you think, well, that was written first. It probably wasn't. Okay, Job's probably recorded first. Obviously, Genesis records the beginning. Issues. Now, I'm moving quick through these things because slow me down if you want to. This stuff's technical. It's not all that devotional, but it is just different data points. And again, this is all in the notes there if you want to look at that. Issues. Again, we talked about the documentary hypothesis. I'm not going to talk about that anymore. Gap theory. What's a gap theory? Gap theory is this idea that between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, that there's a gap. Okay? Now, if you just read the text, are you going to come up with the idea that there's a gap between 1:1 and 1:2? The answer is no. Okay? Naturally, you're not going to, there's a gap there. All right, well, why would you think that? Well, the only reason you would think that is because of what is in the rest of the Bible. And so Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, the gap theory posits that there is this difference in time, the primordial fall of Satan essentially falls in this category, according to this theory. To be perfectly honest with you, I don't know what I think about that. I think it's suspect. I don't know when and how. I don't think Genesis has really much, doesn't care about that occasion at all and doesn't speak to it, which we'll talk about that here in just a second. But there is this thing called the gap theory, and it's the idea that the fall of Satan is between 1:1 and 1:2. Okay, so look, if you believe that, that's fine. I don't care, right? And you'll find it, and this frustrates a lot of people. My take on a lot of things is I don't care. Like there are a lot of trivial things that people pursue, and in the book of Genesis is ripe with all kinds of weird stuff about the Nephilim, and there's where did these guys get wives and all kinds of other stuff. And look, spoiler alert, I'm just going to tell you right now, right? The answer is I don't know and I don't care. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. The gap theory kind of falls into that for me.
What does Calvin say? Wherever God's word ceases to speak, I cease to question.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that here in a little more in a minute. I appreciate you bringing that up with Calvin's good on that. There is something we should say about that. So there's the gap theory. Formless and void is the term there in verse 2. If you look in verse 2, the earth was, quote, formless and void. Tohu wabohu is the Hebrew. Tohu wabohu, which just kind of sounds woo, formless and void. And the idea is that God created the world and then it fell, and now sin is there, and this is prior to even Genesis 3. Satan fell, and it's all just this primordial goo and fallen nastiness. And the reason that they posit some of that is that that word formless and void, can be translated in such a way to indicate judgment or chaos, things like that. And so that is within the realm of translatable. What's the word I'm looking for? It's within the scope of that. So that's where they get the gap theory. So moving on from that, what's the biggest issue with regards to Genesis in modern debate? It has been for the last 200 years. What's the big issue? You know the answer to this.
Whether the earth was created in 6 days or 4.8 million years or whatever.
That's it. Yeah. And the corollary to that, so there's the old earth, young earth thing, and then the corollary to that, or maybe even, I would say even probably more controversial than that, is what? Think about it from an even higher, maybe that's 10,000 feet. Let's look at 30,000 feet. It's creation versus evolution, right? Okay, we all know that, right? That's the big argument, right? And so we've got creationism versus the evolutionary theory, and then you have kind of this third way, which is creationistic or theistic evolution. It's the idea that God used evolution to create what is, or something like that. If you look at Hebrews 11:3, Hebrews 11:3 seems to indicate that God created everything ex nihilo. That's the Latin translation. What's ex nihilo?
Out of nothing.
Out of nothing. Which seems to exclude the idea that he used some kind of, that he took the stuff and then formed the stuff and then the stuff formed its own stuff, or, something like that. It seems to exclude the evolutionary theory. We're going to get into this here in a minute about some of the theological and political implications of this, so I'll save that for that here in just a second. Along that edge, Ryan, you mentioned the old earth versus young earth argument. Is the earth 6,000 years old? How do we get 6,000 years? Where does that number come from? Just add up the genealogies and you end up at 6,000 years. Okay, that's the young earth idea. The old earth idea, where does that come from?
Carbon dating through geologic timescales.
That's it. Carbon dating. Carbon-14 dating is kind of the linchpin to the old earth idea.
There's also like speed of light, distance to stars.
Yeah. That's a fair point.
Cosmological arguments.
Yeah. What we know about the theory of relativity and the speed of light. I'm sorry?
What we think we know about it.
Right, what we think we know about it. It's funny how those things change quite often, actually, and depending on how up you stay on those kinds of things. So old earth versus young earth. There's a lot of argument about the use of the word yom, which is the word for day. So day can mean a 24-hour period. It can mean an epoch or an epic. I say epoch because an epic is an awesome story, but an epoch is a period of time. Those are not the same things, and some people, because their country, pronounce them the same. The word yom can mean 24 hours. It can just mean a period of time. It can mean a long time, and so there's those who would argue for, say, for instance, theistic evolution would say that Genesis doesn't limit. The use of the word yom is not necessarily limited to a 24-hour period or something like that. That's the argument that they would make. Okay. Personally, again, this is my personal opinion. I hold to. I have to hold to a 24-hour period for two reasons. One, because Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. What's in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5? The Ten Commandments. There's a part in there, you remember that, about the Sabbath? And it says that God created everything in 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh. Now, we'll get into that a whole lot more here in a minute, and how that's a very pregnant idea with a whole lot of things involved in it. But it seems to indicate on a very surface and straightforward way that how would the original hearers of that have understood how God created things?
Literally.
Huh?
Literally.
Yeah, in the most straightforward sense that he created. Now, I mean, it does get into issues like how do you have time before you have light, based on what we know about the theory of relativity. Right? What do we know about theory of relativity? What is the relationship between time and the speed of light? You guys know this.
E equals MC squared.
E equals mc squared. Energy equals matter times the speed of light squared, which is a fancy way of saying one of the implications of that is that time itself, our perception of time, maybe not even our perception, but maybe time itself is actually relative to the speed of light. In other words, the faster you go, the slower time moves. Right? This has been proven with nuclear clocks. Einstein predicted it, and then they were able actually to test this. They sent synchronized nuclear clocks, put them up in the, sent one up into the airplane, ran backwards to the Earth's rotation, and they were off. They did this experiment multiple times. Okay, so it gets into all kinds of weird stuff. Star Trek, woo woo woo. All kinds of nerdy, nerdgasms and all that kind of stuff. People go down this whole wormhole. Yes, I use that in that way of goofiness and all kinds of stuff to think about multiverses and all that kind of stuff. Look, you're going to have to make some decisions about what you believe the Bible is. Okay. Now, I will grant you that ancient writers had no concept of some of those things, and they weren't concerned with those things. That being said, I also believe that this is not just a human book. I also believe that it doesn't contain divine inspiration, but that it actually is, as 2 Timothy 3:16 says, divinely expired. And by expired, I mean breathed out, not have a due date or is beyond its usefulness. That God actually, and He breathed out His word, and this word is timeless and endures. And so, my take, because of Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, and there are other passages we could talk about as well, seem to indicate that creation was in 6 literal days, at least the days as we understand them, best that we know how. And here's the problem: if you punt on that and you say, "Well, I'm gonna modify my understanding of the scriptures based on current scientific exploration" or something like that, it creates all kinds of problems for you. It won't be long until you're denying the resurrection. That's the path you're on. That's where that goes, okay? And if you deny the resurrection, then what does that make you?
Anathema.
Yeah. Makes you reprobate. Makes you destined for hell, essentially, okay? And so there are theological implications for this. Another piece of this is indeed, as good Presbyterians, we hold to the Westminster Confession. Westminster Confession of Faith 4:1, the larger catechism 15, and short catechism 9 all seem to indicate that these are 6 days. They don't explain about that, they just say 6 days. This is straightforward, okay? Some people say it's overly simplistic. I would just say I got no problem with a God who creates everything. And we'll get into some more of this. Another question is, are the genealogies exhaustive? So the father of, literally the way that the genealogies read in the book of Genesis is that so-and-so was the father of so-and-so was the father of so-and-so. And can that mean more than just his literal father? Can it mean that he was the ancestor of? Yes, it can. It can mean that. So could there be more time involved in there? And are all of the genealogies completely and totally exhaustive? The answer is I don't know. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Again, I would say that it doesn't really matter all that much. However, even if you do allow for a certain amount of time, you don't end up with millions of years. It's still in the thousands of years. It's not in the millions of years kind of thing. I would also add to this that geological studies, it's funny, and we've got, because we're out here in the oil patch, right, we've got oil field. I'm not Billy Bob Thornton. I'm 80. In the oil field, we have access to a lot of geologists, and of course our business is getting stuff from geological formations and things like that. There is a growing, I wouldn't say that it is a consensus yet, but there is a growing opinion that that rock is just not as old as everybody thinks it is, or that everybody's positing on the front end. And there's even some ideas about regenerating oil and oil not taking near as long to form as people think. I actually went to a presentation 2 weeks ago about migration oil. This guy nerded out for an hour and a half, right, talking about rock and migration. And I'm like, how's this oil migrating through rock? Well, it does, and it's interesting because that oil that he's saying migrated, they already drilled in that area where it came from, and they get oil there, but he thinks there's also oil here. It's a weird thing. Anyway, geological information aside, Art of the Genealogy is exclusive, and I do want to talk about these theological implications, which I've already hinted at. If you punt on creation, it's almost a litmus test to where you will be in 2 or 3 years, theologically. You punt on creation, okay? I can just tell you where you're going to be within the next 5 years. Let's call it 5 years. You're going to be a theological liberal, and then you're going to be an atheist. That's the way that goes, okay? Now, I'm not saying that because you don't want the ends, you shouldn't, pursue these things and think, academically and give academic rigor. In fact, quite the opposite. I believe that the Orthodox Christian position holds strong weight and has the majority of the evidence on its side, and we'll get into that here in just a second. In fact, let's get into it right now. There are also political implications. Those people who are pushing for this kind of stuff, there is a political and powerful motive behind them. It is not apolitical. It is absolutely political. It was political with the Germans in the 17th and 18th centuries, and it's political today. And if you think otherwise, you're just naive. Okay, I say you guys. I know you, and you're not naive. But people that think that, we just want to go where the evidence leads us. Here's the thing about the evidence. Evidence has to be both validated and interpreted. Okay, and to apply critical reasoning skills, I doubt. Let me just use the word doubt because that's one that they love to use. I doubt their validation skills. There's a whole lot of political implications to this. Apologetics. What are apologetics? It's not an apology for the faith, but it is a defense of the faith. There's a couple of things that I want to mention here with regards to Genesis before we jump into the text. Uniformity of the universe doesn't make sense without a creator. Greg Bahnsen was famous for this argument, and it's part of the cosmological not necessarily cosmological argument, but it does fall into this category of or relates to the creation. What is the uniformity of the universe? It's the idea that the universe is predictable. In other words, that today, generally speaking, will be like it was yesterday, like it was the day before, like it was 1,000 years before. What's going to happen here in just a little bit? Right over there. Sun's going to come up in the east, and later this evening, it's going to go down in the west. Okay, if you go up to the top of one of these buildings in downtown here in the tall city and decide to do your Peter Pan thing and hop out of a window, okay, what's going to happen?
You're going to fall at 9.8 meters a second squared and hit the ground. That's
it, right? You're.
What's a meter?
Yeah, and
shut up, engineer.
Yeah, I use freedom units around here. Which is the same that would happen 1,000 years ago, which is the same that will happen 1,000 years from now. That's called the uniformity of the universe. The laws of physics apply pretty much everywhere, all the time, no matter what. That's called the uniformity of the universe. Shut up. Get out of here. That doesn't make sense if it's evolution-based. You do not get the uniformity of the universe. You do not get order, observable order, nor do you get the animal kingdom. We actually call it a kingdom. And categorization. None of that makes any sense from an evolutionary standpoint. It does not follow from the random evolutionary process. The likelihood of evolution actually creating intelligent life, those who have studied such, we could get into this maybe some other time, they have admitted that it is a mathematical impossibility. It's like 0 to the 47th power or something stupid like that. But they still hold out hope, which requires more faith. See, one of the reasons I'm a Christian is not just because I like the outcomes and the theological implications of it or the political implications of it, although those are all wonderful and great, absolutely. But one of the reasons is that the evidence is in our favor. The vast plethora of information available is in our favor. Stephen Meyer, I put an S on there. I got to fix that on the thing. Stephen Meyer and the Discovery Institute. He's written several books, one called The Return of the God Hypothesis. There's several others. He's done an excellent job of explaining how, according to, again, this gets into cosmology and some other things, but that creation is the best explanation for the data that we have available. Let me just say it a little more strongly. The text presents God as an omniscient God who knows and does everything, and that corresponds to the data that we see in creation, and there's not a better explanation of that. As we mentioned earlier, even though it presents an omniscient God, the text itself is not omniscient. What I mean by that is that it does not tell us everything, and nor is it meant to your point that Calvin was making earlier. It's meant to tell us what we need to know, not scratch our intellectual curiosities. And that's the problem, right? I got questions. Sorry. And part of faith is trusting that God gives you enough of what you need. And I'll just tell you, like if you have that kind of people that are really curious, right, tend to be learners and processors, and that's a wonderful thing. It really is. But the thing about it is when they apply that to the Bible, we get into these kind of trivial things about, splitting hairs and all this, what about this and what about that? And we spend all of our time focusing on things that are not primary. Be careful with that. Okay? It can become sinful very quickly. It is a sin. Let me just say it a little stronger. It is a sin to focus on things that God doesn't focus on. He tells us what to focus on. And to refuse to do that is sinful. So, Genesis doesn't scratch all of our itches, doesn't tell us how he did all that he did, just tells us that he did it and who did it. Those are some of the main points. So moving on, any questions about any of that before I... Okay, structure. The book of Genesis can roughly be divided very easily into two parts. 1 through 11:26 and 11:27 through chapter 50. There's 50 chapters, so just think 1 through 11 and 11, because the guy that did the chapter divisions, I wish he would have did that a little differently, but he, whatever. There's before Abraham and after Abraham. That's it and that's all, okay? There's the introduction of Abraham starting in chapter 11, with the genealogy. The genealogies are really important. We'll get into that later. So there's creation and before Abram, 1 through 11:26, and then Abram and after 11:27 through 50. Themes. What are the themes? Well, obviously creation. One of the big things about creation, which we'll talk about today, is that it is, in some sense, a polemic against Egypt and the other nations. What is a polemic? A polemic is a literary, militaristic, aggressive. It's violent literature. Let me put it that way. It's meant to tick some people off. It's meant to pick a fight. Okay? If you think about it in this context, Moses, we assume Moses wrote it. What context did Moses come out of? An Egyptian context. In Egyptian context, what kind of theists are they? Polytheists. They believe that there are multiple gods. So when Moses writes something like Deuteronomy 6:4, which is the John 3:16 for ancient Israel, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one," and 6:5 is, "And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." He was throwing rocks at the Egyptians. It's a polemic against all the other polytheistic nations. Ancient Israel was the only singularly monotheistic group of people ever to exist in the ancient world. Okay, so a big part of what Genesis is doing is that it's not that Ra did this and Osiris did that. It is he's throwing Yahweh, the Lord God, kicked everybody's butt, and he's the one who created everything ex nihilo by the word of his power and just speaking it into existence. Boom, there it happened, just like that. He wasn't lonely, which is a dumb thing that some stupid Christians say sometimes. God does not need you. He wasn't lonely. The triune God wasn't, oh, need somebody to love me. No. He spoke it into existence out of the abundance of his joy and his community. He is a creator. He is creative. And so we see the creation, which is wonderful and beautiful. There is a sense in which all creation is an art masterpiece that the ultimate creator has created. Those are some of the theological implications of that. But in addition to that, it is a polemic. It is meant to throw rocks at the other nations. Baal did not create this. The calf god and the thunder and the lightning and the fertility goddesses and gods and all this nonsense. No, Moses is writing this and God has revealed it in such a way to smack all the other gods upside their head. He'll say things like they have eyes, but they don't see. They have ears, but they don't hear. They have arms, but they're not outstretched. They can't do anything. They're powerless. The idea is that Yahweh God is not just a God, but he is the God. It's a polemic. Other themes. Covenant, promise, and a people. That God deals with people in this thing called a covenant. That's the way he does things. He does things in an obligatory way that involves sacrifice and promise and oaths and cursing. Those are some of the methods. And if you hear on Thursday night, you hear about some of that stuff. The genealogies are key to this. Most people read the genealogies and they're like, oh, here we go. So-and-so begat so-and-so, was the father of so-and-so. Let me cut my wrists, right? What you need to understand is the genealogies are absolutely key. And anytime you see a genealogy, your ears should perk up because there's a change in the narrative that's coming along, okay? And once you understand that, then are you going to use the genealogies as your devotional material? No. Here's the thing. You need to read them quickly so that you can understand that there's a change coming in the text. It should be as a signpost going, woo, woo, woo. The narrative of what's going on is changing. And so there are multiples of these, which we'll get into again. I brought my ESV study Bible, page 40 and 41, talk about these genealogies and give some really helpful charts. I tried to get this in digital format, but I wasn't able to do that. I'll figure that out here before long. Another theme is this idea of the city of God. Of course, Augustine, the early church father, writes a book about this. And it's the idea that God is building a kingdom, yea, a temple city that represents him on the earth. In fact, the earth is his footstool. The earth is his temple. And we, as his vice regents, this gets into the cultural mandate, 126 and 27. We are his vice regents on the earth, and that the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. That idea is mentioned at least 3 times in the Old Testament, particularly in the prophets, Habakkuk 2:4 being one of them. So the idea of the city of God, the dwelling place of God, that God manifests himself, because God is spirit, but he's created this physical world. Another one of the themes, of course, is that in the narrative is the idea or the dealing with the patriarchs. Who are the patriarchs? You know the answer to this. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? This is where you got the VBS song, Father Abraham, many sons had Father Abraham. I don't ever understand how dispensationalists could sing that, but that's a whole other thing. It was supposed to be funny, but, well, you guys laughed. All right, good. Because they don't consider themselves fathers. Children of Abraham. That's a whole other issue. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the second half of the book of Genesis is all about the patriarchs. It's all about the biggest chunk is about Abraham. There's a little bit about Isaac, and then it's talking about who? It's not even Jacob. It's Joseph. It's primarily Joseph, and the whole thing about Egypt. And of course, that's introducing Exodus and what's going to happen in the book of Exodus. And so those are some of the themes in the book of Genesis. Literarily, what kind of literature is it? We said earlier it's prose narrative, and that just means that's just fancy technical way of saying that it's telling a story. It's prose, which means it's in everyday kind of language for the most part. It's narrative in that it's telling you, it's episodic. So this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Genesis is that way. Exodus, well, particularly Leviticus and Deuteronomy, are less prose narrative, and they're actually legal documents. At least a big chunk of them are, and it tells you, how the law is. And that's a different kind of literature. That's all that we're saying there, okay? It's a different genre, if you want a fancy word, spelled genre. You want to put a $5 bill around that. Genesis is not only the introduction to the Pentateuch, but it's also the introduction and foundation for the entire Bible and all of history. So let's get into some of the stuff why you come to this study. It is ultimately a story about God and His creation and how they are to relate to one another. That's what Genesis is really all about, right? We know this. It's a story about God. It's a story about humanity. It's a story about everything that exists. Where did it come from? Why is it here? And what should we be seeking to do with all this? But Genesis answers some of those questions for us, especially in the early parts. Some key chapters, okay, in Genesis. Of course, 1 through 3, you've got the creation, the cultural mandate, and the fall. Genesis chapter 3 is the fall, okay? We could talk about the difference between Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2 kind of being a subset of Genesis 1, and we'll get into that later. 7 through 9, you remember, let me see if I can do this off of memory. Adam and Eve, Cain kills Abel. Things get sideways, it gets worse, and then God does what? It's the flood. Yeah, so Genesis 7 through 9 is the story of Noah and the ark and the flood and all of that kind of stuff. After the flood, you have the table of nations. That's going to be important later on as we get into things where everybody came from. Because from the table of nations, here's the thing. God starts with a man. Things go sideways. And then he goes and gets another man. And who's that man? Well, it's Abram, and he comes through the line of Seth. It's really, if you watch this from a genealogical perspective, like there's like hundreds of people, and he'll pick a guy. And this is the funny thing about election, that people don't like election because, it seems to violate human will and all that kind of stuff. It's like, man, you can't get away from it, brother. Right? He just does. Well, that's not fair. Well, read Romans 9. Take it to him and shut your mouth. Right? And he does what he wants. He sits in the heavens and does what he wants. Right? It doesn't mean that we don't have agency and all these kinds of things, but that's the thing. People really don't understand how to put that together from a logical perspective. That's a whole other issue. But the table of nations, it tells us, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, where these guys come from. Chapter 11 is the Tower of Babel. So God had told them in Genesis 1, 26 and 27 to fill the earth and subdue it. Multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And what do? Instead of building a city for God on earth, what do? They build a city for themselves. See, God's city expands, theirs stays concentrated. There's a huge story about a huge level of implications about this. So the Tower of Babel is chapter 11. So 50 chapters from chapter 11. Chapter 12 and 15 are the Abrahamic covenant, or it's the introduction of Abram, and then the covenant in chapter 15 is primary. Chapter 15 has the most quoted. If you ask the question, how does the New Testament refer to Genesis? Genesis 15 is quoted in the New Testament more than anywhere else. Or anything else in the book of Genesis. Let me say it that way. Okay, and I'll put together a little chart for us so we can look at that later on. Chapters 18 through 19 is Sodom and Gomorrah. Of course, that's crouched in the issue of Lot, who is Abram's nephew, and all that kind of stuff. But it's a famous thing having to do, of course, typically we think about homosexuality. We, in fact, call people sodomites because of that story. Chapter 22 is the sacrifice of Isaac. So Isaac is the promised son. God says, sacrifice him, and Abram's willing to do that. That's 22. Isaac's blessing of Jacob is 27. And the reason that's important is because is Jacob the older son? No, Esau's the older son, but he gets chinooked by Jacob. And so it's kind of a change in the story. Chapter 37, so I'm skipping real fast. We just jumped 10 chapters, is Joseph's dream. So we have the introduction of Joseph. So Abraham has Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons. Joseph is the youngest of those sons. And then he has the dream. Remember, he's the dreamer. He has the dreams. And, of course, his brothers get mad about that, sell him into slavery, throw him in a pit, and all that kind of good stuff. And then a few chapters later, 4 chapters later, in chapter 41, somebody else has a dream. At this point, where's Joseph? He's in Egypt, and somebody has a dream. Who's that person? Pharaoh. Pharaoh has a dream. So Joseph has a dream, then Pharaoh has a dream, and Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams. Prior, he had already, the chief baker and the cupbearer and all that thing happens before that. But that's a turning point in the story, right? You start to see the redemption of Joseph. And then by the end of the book, one of the key verses, and this is a verse that you ought to memorize, memorize 1:26 through 27 and Genesis 50:20. Those are the two ones you just absolutely 100% got to have. And Genesis 50:20 is Joseph's recounting of what happened when his brothers come to him, and they're all flipped out, and they've all kind of made up at this point, and it's the last chapter of the book. And what does Joseph say? What you meant for evil, God meant for good. In many ways, that is kind of the point of the book of Genesis. That we serve a sovereign God, that in spite of human decision and failure, still rules and reigns forevermore. And whatever human intentions are out there for evil and bad and ugliness and all the rest of that, sin, God ultimately, he's the biggest winner. He always wins. He always kicks everybody else's rear end. He always is on top. And that's good for us. That's good for us. Not because we're good, but because he has chosen to bring us to himself. And glory be to God. Man, I'm kind of just stop right there if we wanted to. The text itself, verse 1. Didn't think we were ever going to get there. Well, here we go. We'll do one verse. What does it say? In the beginning, in the Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, you don't have to keep looking because that's all it says. And that's all we're going to talk about. John chapter 1. What's John chapter 1? Do you remember anything about John chapter 1? Yeah. Here's what it says. In the beginning, same language. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos. We don't have a really good way of translating that word Logos into English. It was a very pregnant term, full of Greek philosophy. It's the idea, we get our word logic. It's also the word that we translate word. It's the communication of God. It's the logic of God. What is the word? Well, if you actually look in the Bible and in John 1, the word is capitalized because it's referring, of course, to the eternal Word of God, Jesus, the second person of the triune God. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This shows up because of John 1. It shows up particularly, so if you were at MRC yesterday, we recited the Nicene Creed. Jesus is very God of very God, begotten, not created. This is the old ancient Arian heresy that says that he was the first of all creation. He's the first. He's the primary, but he was a created being. And both John would have said, and the creed following John would have said, no, absolutely not. Jesus is the creator. He is not created. Verse 3, all things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has not come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. So you have a lot of the same language that you see in Genesis. You get more of a philosophical undergirding of what John's writing in his gospel, probably to some Romans. You just have this kind of overlap in the New Testament that when it says in Genesis that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, the Trinity was involved. We know later in a couple of verses we'll see that the Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the deep. The act of creation itself is a Trinitarian act. The Father decrees, the Son executes, and the Spirit, I don't know how to say that, the Spirit brings it about. Colossians 1:16 says, talking about Jesus, "For in him all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth, visible and invisible," which is another way of saying whatever there is, however it is all from, in, and through him. Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is not only the beginning, but he is the end. There's a couple of verses we'll look at here in a second to talk about that. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. In him all things. It's the idea that the world would fly apart. What is the most massive thing in the universe? Well, the answer is God. I suspect, and I don't hold me to this, okay? This gets into metaphysics. Why is it that mass creates gravity? Nobody knows the answer to that. We just punt, right? If we're theists, we just say because that's just the way God made it, right? I suspect there's some kind of weird mystery going on there, and that because Jesus has a body, I don't know. I don't want to get too weird into this, but like there is some weird metaphysical connection to this idea. Everything is held together by him, and I mean, on the most simple level, you could just say he's powerful and he keeps it all from flying apart. One of the means by which he does that is gravity. We would all fly apart if it weren't for gravity, right? What happens if you go out into space without a spacesuit?
You explode.
Yeah, you disintegrate. Much like Isaiah described in the presence of God. "Woe is me, for I am undone," he says. "I'm a man of unclean lips in the midst of a people of unclean lips." The idea is that he's coming apart at the seams. He's flying apart. There's something that's moving him. Here it says that all things, this is Colossians, hold that in him, that's Jesus, all things hold together. He is the head of the body, which is the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn of the dead, and he himself will come to have first place among a preeminency among everything. So again, it's this idea that Jesus is, he's king. These is some of the language that we see in other places. Colossians 1:16 through 20. It's interesting, if you look in your Bible, depending on what translation you're using, the ESV doesn't do this, and it's unfortunate, but the LSB actually has a different typeset in 1:16 through 20, and it's offset as poetic material because it's probably an early Christian hymn. Paul is actually probably quoting something that they sing, or perhaps he's written something that's poetry that becomes a hymn. So you see a very early example of how the early church views Jesus as being equivalent with the Father and the Son in creation. Of course, we know at the end of the book, the end of the Bible, so today we're looking at Genesis 1:1 at the very end. So Revelation has 22 chapters. In chapter 21, verse 6, and in chapter 22, verse 13, so the last two chapters of the Bible, what does it say about Jesus? That he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Of course, Alpha and Omega are the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. Again, it coincides with the idea that Colossians is mentioned, that Paul mentioned in Colossians, that everything that is, everything that ever has been, everything that ever will be, is all created for him, by him, through him, and he holds it all together. He's everywhere. There's nothing he doesn't know. There's not anything that he can't do, that he hasn't limited himself or his character doesn't qualify that. He is all in all. In fact, he is indeed what we find out later in the book of Exodus. He is the great I am. He exists, and there is no existence apart from him. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the term heavens and earth is probably just meant to encapsulate everything that exists, right? It probably doesn't just mean, the earth and there's other planets. Well, what about them? Is there a different God? Let me just address this nonsense for a second about aliens, okay? I don't care. It doesn't matter. Everybody weirding out, and like I know a guy that has written all this stuff, and he even talks about how the different names of God, like he basically bastardizes the documentary hypothesis and JEDP, and talks about how aliens have shown up and angels and all this kind of stuff. Look, I think people that let me just say it a little stronger. Maybe there are aliens, maybe there are. I don't know. If there are, it doesn't matter. They still have to submit to King Jesus. He's not just the ruler. We're not Mormons. We don't believe that this is just his planet. That's part of their theology, right? That God has all these wives and we're all part of his sons and we get to be our own God and we'll get our own planet one day. It's some of their goofy cosmological stuff that they don't ever advertise that on TV. That's not part of their deal. But this whole alien obsession and all that kind of stuff, it's a big glowing distraction, is what it is. I tend to think that most of that stuff's demonic. I tend to think that that's where most of that's coming from and what it is. It's a distraction. It's a deception, and the fascination with it is also demonic. Again, if they exist, who cares? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. When was the beginning? Doesn't say. That's kind of like asking, what is time? Can you define time? It's the passing of time. It's a measurement of moments. It's hard to describe. There was a yesterday, there's a today, there's a now, and there's a future, but like we can say things about it, but it's really obtuse and very hard to define. What's the beginning? I don't know. Whatever the beginning was, the beginning of material existence, God created it, ex nihilo, by the word of his power. There seems to even indicate that he probably, there is a translation that kind of hints at this idea and picks up on the idea that much of the early parts of Genesis could be construed as poetry. Less narrative and more poetry. And the idea being that the Creator actually, even the recounting of how the Creator did what he did is creative. That he recorded it in a creative way. You might even say that he sang it into existence, which is a wild thought because you don't typically think about God singing. You think about him decreeing and all of that's right and true. But you have the existence of a happy God is kind of the idea. The Creator creates not out of his deficit, but out of his abundance of who he is and his character. He doesn't create because he's lonely. He creates because he's good. And that's what good and powerful beings do, is they create. They don't destroy, they create, which is a great lesson for your kids. Quit tearing up my stuff, you punk. Being a little reprobate, Takes a strong man to create something. We've talked about that before. So, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Doesn't seem to allow for some kind of evolutionary process, although there are those who would try to posit that. I would reject that personally, and I would probably commend that to you because I think it has theological and political implications that you don't want to go down. And the text in no way seems to indicate any of that. It really does come down to, on some of these things, do you believe the Bible or don't you? And that may seem very narrow-minded, and that may seem very... what's the word I'm looking for? Unsophisticated. It's not. It's not that it's unsophisticated. It's a matter of faith. It really is a matter of faith. Do you believe it or don't you? Do you believe what the Bible says about existence or don't you? It really just kind of comes down to that on a lot of things. And if that turns us into, they can use whatever scare words they want. If that turns me into a simpleton or an unsophisticated or a redneck or it's certainly not uneducated, because let me tell you, I'm educated about it. I just don't care about your opinion. And your opinion is unbased in more ways than one. If you know what based means, right? It has no basis. So, all that being said, it's 7 o'clock. You got any questions? If you do, come talk to me afterwards because we're out of time. Lord God in heaven, thank you for your word and for the worldview that it provides. Help us to trust you as the creator of all things. For Christ, his covenant for 1,000 years by the work of the Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen.